Now we're ready to move into Standard 5. This deals with investment analysis, recommendations, actions. And this is, again, part of the heart, or at least what I view as the heart of the material. So 3 was how we deal with clients. 4, we dealt with employers. Here, this is what we actually do. So when all those phrases that we've seen as we've gone through that said, whenever you are, making an analysis, a recommendation, taking actions, all that sort of stuff, this is what it's talking about, right? So all the other stuff talks about when we do that. This is talking about actually doing that, right? So I think there's some things in here that are really key and highly testable. And like I said, 3, 4, and 5, I think that's sort of the heart of the material. I put a little emphasis on 3, but of course, everything is testable, and trying to predict what's going to be on the exam is always a hazardous game. So I'm not trying to predict what's going to be on the exam, but I think to understand the material overall, you're going to have a very clear understanding, especially of 3, and then 4 and 5 I would put just behind that in terms of sort of the intellectual synergy category. That is, if you understand this, then you're going to understand the other things around it even better. So let's look at one, this diligence and a reasonable basis. Okay, back to my idea of pillars. So I talked about pillar 1. I cheated there and I took the 2 things, objectivity, and I put that with loyalty, right? So that came from 2 different places, but I said I'm going to have the ability to make good decisions, and then I'm actually going to make good decisions. That was my first pillar. Then my third pillar was suitability. That is, I'm going to specifically consider the client's portfolio. That is, the client's objectives and constraints when I make a decision or, a recommendation or take action, that type of thing. Well, this is what I think of as the second pillar. That is diligence and a reasonable basis. Why is this the second pillar, and why did I make the suitability the third pillar? Well, okay, so I'm gonna be objective, right? So I don't have my decision-making process tainted by conflicts of interest, that type of thing. I've actually decided that I'm going to be an ethical person and I want to be loyal. Well, before I can determine suitability, okay, as my third pillar, I first have to understand the security itself. So what we're talking about here is exercising diligence, independence, and thoroughness, okay, in analyzing investments and making recommendations, all that sort of stuff. So the point is we have to have a reasonable and adequate basis supported by research. Okay, very important word here, not hearsay, not the fact that somebody else said it, anything like that, supported by research for the actions that we take. So we're going to make good decisions. We're going to be objective. We're going to have a high level of diligence to understand the security itself. And then once we understand the security's risk and return parameters, then we can determine suitability. So that's what I think of as the 3 pillars. So this would actually be pillar number 2 in my book, a diligence, reasonable basis. And remember, it can't be some sort of perfunctory type thing. Again, the notion of intent is going to be really important. So if the analyst is, skipping steps in the research process or not getting data that would be important because it's hard to get, those types of things, okay, well, then they are not being diligent. They won't have a reasonable basis, and their research is going to be sloppy. Okay, so they are going to be in violation of Standard 5A here. So we want to make a reasonable effort to cover all. Again, this word bothers me, but nonetheless, that's what we got. A reasonable effort to cover all relevant issues when arriving at an investment recommendation. The level of diligence may depend on the product or service offered. Again, this is one of these nods to the practicality. So if we have somebody who just wants us to do X for them, that's the level of service they're paying for. We've disclosed that there are other levels of service they could pay for. Well, then I think this would be okay. So I think that's a caveat. I don't think that's what they're going to rely on for exam purposes. Okay, but nonetheless, this idea that we want to cover all relevant issues when we are taking investment action. And again, the notion of conceptualizing this in terms of a fiduciary practitioner with discretionary authority over an unsophisticated investor's portfolio, okay, that's where it really hones the issue. So if you can say, look, I've got somebody that has a fiduciary responsibility that actually makes decisions, discretionary, they decide what to buy and what to sell for this unsophisticated investor. If there's no violation there, then there's not a violation, because that's the easiest environment in which to have a violation. So then you can back off and say, well, what if they don't have discretionary authority? Or what if the investor is sophisticated as opposed to unsophisticated? Or what if there's a different level of service required here? So all those things can be considered if there is if there is a potential violation. But if there's no violation with the fiduciary and the unsophisticated investor, that means we've risen to that high a level, then that's going to be the easiest environment in which to observe a violation. So that might be one way to think about as a starting point for analyzing scenarios on the exam. Okay, what about secondary or third-party research? Well, because we're using something that someone else has prepared, okay, we have to determine the soundness of the research. That is, the assumptions, the rigor, the timeliness of the data, the motivations of the whoever prepared the research. So if you're going to take a research report from someone else, you're going to take this paragraph and put it into your research report. Well, of course, if they're from a different firm, you have attribution issues, right? Plagiarism we talked about previously. But also, you're responsible for making sure that was well done, right? The assumptions were appropriate, the analysis was rigorous, they're using timely data, and the motivation for that research report was not somehow tainted by employer or issuer type payment, that type of thing, right? So anyway, so if you're going to use third-party research, you're responsible for its soundness. Okay, the firm should adopt a policy for periodic review of the quality of third-party research. So if you're regularly going to take something from a third party, then you're going to have to make sure and have some sort of mechanism in place to determine whether or not that research is something that you in fact can hang your hat on, that you can use and be reasonably comfortable that it's going to be something that will add value to what you're doing. Okay, recommended procedures. Establish a policy that research and recommendation should have a reasonable and adequate basis. Right? Well, that's sort of the title of what we're doing here. Okay, but that's got to be policy. You should have a reasonable and adequate basis. And then when you have these reports that are issued or recommendations that are made or even actions that are taken, there should be some sort of review of research reports and recommendations prior to external circulation. So if you've got this, you're going to, again, the classic example of a research department. So you're going to be in equity research. You're going to issue buy, hold, sell recommendations on different firms. Okay, well, the analyst is going to work up the recommendation. Okay, there's probably going to be a review process, right? So some sort of committee, at least some sort of a supervisor that is going to review that before it is circulated externally. Well, that's something that is going to be one of the best practices. All right, so more recommendations here. Establish due diligence procedures for judging if recommendation has met the reasonable and adequate basis criteria. So how do we determine if we were looking at a research report, it's done by one of the analysts in our particular stable, we're determining whether to release that to the public. Okay, well, there ought to be some due diligence procedures that the committee or the supervisor can implement to determine whether this meets the reasonable and adequate basis criteria. And then, in typical ethics material fashion, we should develop measurable criteria for assessing the quality of research. Now, notice they don't tell us what is this measurable criteria, which there could be lots of things they could do there. But nonetheless, we ought to have some way to determine the quality of research and something other than J.D. Power's initial quality test. It's got to be something that is more forward-looking than that. So coming up with measurable criteria, not an easy thing. And I think wisely, the material here doesn't try to specify what it is. But as a firm or a supervisor, someone, a responsible party, then you are charged with developing some sort of measurable criteria for assessing the quality of the research. You should consider scenarios outside recent experience to assess the downside risk of quantitative models. Notice that this came into the curriculum after the financial crisis, meaning that when we looked at all these CDOs, and we had these AAA rated CDOs that ended up being worth 4% of their initial value, that type of thing. Well, what happened there? Well, the real problem was correlation risk, but as tangential to that, okay, was the fact that we said, look, if we're looking at subprime mortgages, the highest default rate we've ever seen is X, and we tested that to 2X or something like that. Well, then we needed, if we had tested this to a higher level, right, more fallout from a mortgage crisis, that type of thing, well, we might have been able to see some of this coming. The point here is, if we look at the price of oil, and we think that's a factor in the value of a firm, well, if we look at the price of oil and we say, well, here's the price of oil today, and I'm just going to call it for a number, I'm going to say it's $50. Well, if we say, well, over the last 6 months, it's been from 45 to 55, and that's the range that we use, okay, well, that's just considering recent experience, right? We want to consider something outside the realm of recent experience when we're testing our quantitative models. And you see, ex post, you see spectacular examples of people who didn't do that, or analysts who didn't do that, who didn't test outside of observable parameters. And then, of course, it always makes the news when they melt down and lots of people lose a lot of billions of dollars. So anyway, we've been burnt by this, and now it's not just good economics, it's actually ethical. It rises to an ethical issue to test outside of this recent experience. We want to make sure the firm has procedures to evaluate external advisors that they use or promote, including how often to review. So if we are, again, using this third-party research or external advisors, or we're recommending external advisors to clients, we need to have some sort of review process that includes how we determine quality and how often we're going to go in and review them. So written procedures of acceptable scenario testing, the range of scenarios, cash flow sensitivity, and cash flow sensitivity to our assumptions and inputs. Again, this is more of the same story we were talking about on the last slide, but you have to have some way of judging what is appropriate for stress testing a model. Okay, procedures for evaluating outside information providers, again, including how often. And I think maybe importantly down here, it's one of these things where you get to where you can't see the forest for the trees. But remember, a lot of these decisions are made by committees, right? So if you're in a committee, there's 5 people, and you think that this firm should be a sell, and the other 4 think it should be a buy, right? And so you've used your best analysis, and you think, oh, this is obviously a sell, but everybody else thinks that the firm should be a buy, right? Well, do you need to dissociate from group research? And the answer is no, you don't, as long as the group is properly motivated. So you've got 5 people going to make a decision. You're the outlier, okay? But the others all have, there's multiple ways to interpret economic data. So interest rates increase. Is that good or bad, right? So it's going to have, the impact is going to be ambiguous, at least in some cases. So if we have difference of opinion that is based on, I guess in some sense an honest or good faith difference of opinion, then you don't have to say, oh, you guys are wrong and I have to dissociate because I'm an ethical person. No, as long as everyone was approaching it from an ethical point of view, meaning they were honestly evaluating, I'm looking at this model, I'm looking at this economic data, we're just interpreting it different. Well, you don't have to dissociate like you would if there was an ethical violation. Now, if everybody else is saying, oh, we're going to call this a buy because we want their investment banking business, well, then that's different, right? So you have to have the other people in the group making the decision on, based on economics and honest disagreement, okay? Okay, so standard 5B, communication with clients and prospective clients. So this is, we're going to actually talk about the communication here. So what is it that we want to communicate? We're going to disclose the basic format or general principles of the investment processes that we use when we analyze investments or select securities, that type of thing. Okay, and importantly here, we're going to talk about this more later, but promptly disclose any changes that may affect those processes materially. Now, if you happen to be, managing a portfolio that people are buying into, do you have to give away? You have to give away the farm, right? You have to say, here's the models we use, all this sort of thing. Okay, well, no, you don't have to give away proprietary models and that type of thing, but you do have to talk about basic format and general principles. So, what is it that drives your decision process? How do you evaluate securities? What are going to be important factors? Well, if you've got some sort of particularly or you think particularly robust forecasting system that uses some new quantitative method, so you're going to, be using some new statistical technique and looking at data that's different than what everyone else looks at. You don't have to give away the farm, but you do have to disclose generally how you go about this. And if you change it, you have to disclose that to your clients promptly. Okay, so you have to disclose the risks and limitations, okay, associated with the investment process. So again, this I would refer back here to the notion of when we were talking about performance presentation, and we we discussed the sophistication of the audience. Well, again, if you're presenting to Hank and Ethel, Okay, you have to say, look, this is an equity portfolio. That means it can go up, but it can also go down. Here's the historical, whatever it happens to be. If you're presenting to the investment committee at, a big pension fund, they probably understand that equity securities have some, downside risk, I guess would be one way to phrase that. So you're probably going to have this idea of audience sophistication, but you need to be able to disclose the risks and limitations of the investment process. So regardless of the sophistication, you're going to have information available about risks and limitations associated with your process. So use reasonable judgment in identifying which factors are important to the investment analysis, and include those factors when you're communicating with clients and prospective clients. So again, use reasonable judgment when you determine which factors are going to be included, and then include those factors when communication. Right? So there's risks, limitations. What are going to be the drivers of those risks and limitations, and then make sure you inform the client of that. Okay, we've talked about before this notion of distinguish between fact and opinion, but very important here. Okay, distinguish between fact and opinion when you're making a presentation, telling something about your investment analysis, communicating with clients. And the point is this: if I say sales will double next year, okay, well, I'm stating that like it's a fact. If I say, in my forecast, sales could double next year, then I'm stating that as an opinion. So you can state opinions as long as you arrive at them honestly. You can't lie, right? But as long as you arrive at them honestly, you can state opinions all day long. Just make sure that you are stating opinions as opinions, right? So facts are facts, opinions are opinions, never the twain shall meet. So you want to make sure that you're identifying what is a fact. Sales increased, or maybe if you want to be really explicit, reported revenues increased over the last year by X%. Well, that's something that's reported, so you're being very clear about what it is that increased by X%, and it's historical data. On the other hand, saying that you believe something's going to happen in the future, that would have to be an opinion. Clearly communicate potential gains and losses. Again, there's going to be a sophistication overlay to this, but you need to talk to your clients about potential gains and losses on an investment. All right? So when you're communicating with clients, distinguish between fact and opinion, and make sure that they understand what the limitations, risks are, what the potential gains and losses on the investment are, and you will be compliant with the material. So guidance here, include basic characteristics of the security. And so if it's an equity portfolio you're talking about, well, what are the characteristics of an equity portfolio? Inform clients of any change in the investment process. Really important, okay? And we'll see more on this later, but if you're changing the way you do things, so the process you're using for selecting securities changes materially. And that doesn't say that you changed your beta estimation from 36 to 42 months. So that's probably not a material change, since beta didn't work anyway. But nonetheless, you've got this, if you're going to change materially the way you're doing it, you've got to make sure that you're disclosing that to the clients in advance. Suitability, well, we've already talked about suitability, and we've already talked about portfolio context, but remember, that applies here as well. And then again, like we've discussed previously, this is all communication. It's not just a formal report. I'm writing up the report. I'm an equity analyst, research analyst. I write up my report. I give it my recommendation. Okay, if I'm talking to clients, okay, if I'm emailing with a client, trying to drum up business, whatever it happens to be, well, this is going to be, that's going to be covered communication as well. All right? Okay, recommended procedures. The inclusion or exclusion of information depends on a case-by-case review. So what does that mean? Well, that means that it depends on the scenario in which you are making this presentation or communicating your ideas. But again, I'll use the story of Hank and Ethel versus the investment committee, right? So what exactly is included or excluded is going to be very different in those two cases. And of course, we always have to maintain records. We'll see some more of this, but maintain records to support whatever conclusions we have drawn. So keep that in mind. And to talk about record retention, here we are at Standard 5C. So Standard 5C is explicitly record retention, and it rises to the level of an ethical requirement now. This was something that's actually been added over the last few years. But nonetheless, recording or making sure that you have records to support your decisions is what we're talking about here. So you have to develop and maintain appropriate records to support your analysis, the recommendations that you've made, the actions you've taken, or anything else that you've done that you communicated to clients or prospective clients. So you've got, the problem with the world today, at least from the financial analyst point of view, is not that there's not enough information, it's that there's too much information, right? So we have to decide what information we're using, and then we need to have records of that going forward, and there's some pretty significant aspects of that. We'll see. So guidance, maintain records to support research and the rationale for conclusions. So we did some research. Okay, we used data somewhere to do that. We used reports, whatever it was. Okay, and some of that led directly to our conclusions. We need to maintain those records. Okay, now this is where things get sticky. Records are the firm's property and cannot be taken when a member leaves without the firm's consent. So you've generated lots of records to support what you're doing. Okay, and you've done it all there while you're sitting in your cubby. You've got it on your computer. Okay, you could download it onto a pen drive. Okay, but that's the firm's property, and you can't take it with you when you leave, right? So that has some implications we'll see in just a moment. Okay, but nonetheless, those records are the firm's property. If there's no regulatory requirement or firm policy, so the firm has a policy of how long we're going to retain records, or there's no government regulation about how long we have to retain it, then CFAI recommends a retention period of 7 years. So how long do you retain all that stuff? Well, if you got stuff that's 5 years old, you probably want to keep it on your hard drive going forward, is what this is saying. All right? Okay, so recommended procedures. This is actually a counter-example to my previous assertion that this was an employer-oriented document, right? So it seems like there's a lot of employer influence in the standards of practice, but nonetheless, responsibility to maintain records generally falls with the firm. So the records are the firm's property. You are the firm's employees. They should have procedures, and that should be, something they review. Are you actually complying? Should be part of what's going on. However, okay, so even though that basically falls to the firm to provide enough hard disk space and all that type of stuff, okay, individuals must retain documents that support investment-related communication. Individuals, me and you, have to retain documents that support investment-related communication. Okay, and here's where this gets even stickier, I think. Okay, when a member changes firms, okay, you have to recreate the records from public sources or the new firm's information. So in other words, you can't just say, well, if you have to go back, and that's not to say you have to recreate every analysis you've ever done, but if you ever have to defend your analysis, like in court, okay, then you can't just rely on memory. Oh, I think I did this and I think I did that. Okay, you're going to have to go and get public information or resources at your new firm. Okay, but you can't rely just on memory or the materials from the old firm, because the old firm, they're no longer your employer. You left. That's what this is talking about. And they have no obligation to give you those records or material. So anyway, if you leave the firm, you may be in a situation where you have to recreate records from public sources or resources that belong to your new employer. All right, so that is Standard 5. And as you can see, there's lots of stuff in there that makes for, I think, a highly testable material. So let's move on and talk about Standard 6. That is conflicts of interest. And you ought to be feeling a little better about now because, we've started out way back there with Standard 1, and we've been going at this for a long time, but we've got 5 of the 7 behind us. This one isn't too long, and the 7th one's even shorter. So and what I'm trying to communicate to you is this is going to end. So take another swig of your Red Bull and, hang in for a little bit longer, and we are going to get through this, all right? So sometimes when I talk about the ethics material, I talk about 3 pillars and a caveat. Right? So my 3 pillars, we already discussed that. Pillar 1 was, objectivity and loyalty smushed together. 2 was, diligence and a reasonable basis. Okay? And 3 was suitability. The caveat is conflict of interest. So what if there's some problem with your loyalty or objectivity, or there's something that has impaired your ability to do research of the normal diligence that would be expected, or suitability was not considered appropriately because of whatever external factor there was. Well, the caveat to the pillars is going to be this notion of conflict of interest and its we shouldn't call it a cure, but I don't know. So I guess I'll call it a cure. I don't have a better word. So the cure is disclosure. So what we're really going to be talking about primarily with conflict of interest is the idea that if there is some flaw, in particular in one of our three pillars here, okay, then we have to disclose it. Now, it's not a cure for things like misrepresentation. So you can't say, well, I was lying to you earlier, but here I told you I was lying. Okay, well, you can't lie to begin with. But if there's some reason that you don't have the full implementation, you're not as objective, you're not 100% objective, you can't be 100% loyal because of other outside commitments, same with pillars 2 and 3, then we're talking about a conflict, and the remedy here is disclosure. So what we're going to do is disclose these conflicts. So we want to make full, fair disclosure of, again, this word really bothers me, all matters that could reasonably be expected to impair your independence, objectivity, or interfere with duties to clients, prospects, or employers. How do you interpret this? Again, this is something where we're reading the scenario on the exam, and we're saying, well, should that be disclosed or shouldn't it be disclosed? Well, the joke I like to tell is, look, if you're doing anything other than serving as the assistant coach on your 7-year-old daughter's soccer team, then you probably need to disclose. So if you get promoted from assistant coach to coach, well, you're probably going to have to note that on your research reports. And obviously, I'm being facetious, but my point is, when we talk about make full and fair disclosure of all matters, okay, what needs to be disclosed has a low threshold on the exam. So if you think, well, there doesn't seem to be a very direct link between this issue and this recommendation, if you can conjure a story where it has some impact, then the cure would be to disclose it, right? And again, I think in a very wise nod to practicality here, okay, we have to ensure that disclosures are prominent and delivered in plain language. So the fact that you wrote a 37-page research report, and then on the bottom of page 29 you have a footnote that discloses something that some sort of conflict of interest, that's not prominent. And if you do it in legalese rather than plain language, then that would be a violation as well. So when we disclose all of these matters, okay, we have to make sure that it's prominent and that it's in plain language. Okay. All right. So in terms of guidance here, disclose to clients. Let's talk about clients first. Okay, all matters that could impair objectivity, and that allows the clients to judge our motives and our potential biases, right? So if we're saying, look, I'm recommending a buy on this company, but I also serve on the company's board, and I have stock options that incentivize me over here to, whatever it is. Well, now I'm getting you to buy these securities. Well, my recommendation may be something you agree with, but at least as the client, you have knowledge of my conflict, so you can say, well, do I trust this guy? Is this, or his biases overwhelming his better judgment here? So this could be, between a member or firm and the issuer. So if you've got, a member, that would be me as the analyst, and the firm serving on the board, that would be a conflict. Or the firm and the company, that would be an investment banking relationship, those types of things. All those would have to be disclosed as part of my disclosure to clients, right? Now, what about disclosure to employers? Well, we've talked a little bit about this already, and lots of stuff that has to be disclosed. Okay, but again, conflicts of interest here would be ownership of the stock that you are analyzing or that you're recommending. If you're, again, participating on a board, you have financial or other pressures to that could influence your decision making. Well, you need to be disclosing those to your employer as well. So it's not just to clients. Okay, so it's also to whoever employs you. Oh, I'm serving on this board, I have this stock incentive, that type of thing. So it also covers conflicts that could be damaging to the employer's business. So even if you don't think this has the possibility to taint my decision making to this particular client or to my clients in general, but it could damage the employer's business. Okay, again, employer-oriented document slightly. Then covers this conflict that could be damaging to your employer's business. You have to disclose that, right? So employers need to know if you're doing something that could be damaging to their reputation or sustainability. Recommended procedures here: disclose compensation arrangements with employers that conflict with clients' interest. So we're not supposed to have compensation arrangements that conflict with clients' interest, but if we do, and that occurs on occasion, then we've got to make sure that that is going to be disclosed. So if the firm doesn't permit disclosure, that is, the firm has some sort of policy. This is how we reward our analysts, and you think that that is, creates a conflict, right? For instance, we only look at upside, right? So we're going to make recommendations for buy, and we make a lot of buy recommendations because that generates more activity in the firm. Okay, well, that presents a conflict of interest because it impacts your, the number of buy recommendations you make determines your salary. Well, if the firm doesn't disclose that, and that's probably such an egregious violation, it's a violation of something else, but if the firm doesn't want something disclosed, okay, then you're going to have to dissociate from the activity. Either, okay, I'm not going to make recommendations in this sphere, whatever it is, or in the limit, I have to go find a different employer, right? So anyway, if there's truly a conflict, it has to be disclosed. So firms are encouraged to include compensation information in promotional materials, and you've seen this become more and more embedded in our industry. That is, if you read a research report, somewhere in there, it's going to have some sort of disclaimer about, well, whoever wrote this report, this is the way they're compensated, some basics outlines. So you've seen this sort of permeate practice more and more over recent years. Okay, so let's look at 6B, priority of transactions. And I think we've mostly covered this as a discussion of sort of tangential to the other areas, but this certainly makes it explicit. So investment transactions for clients and employers must have priority over transactions in which the member or candidate is a beneficial owner. Okay, and that is to say, look, if you're trading for yourself, okay, or you're a beneficial owner, which means that you're going to benefit whether it is directly or, indirectly. So that's, you're going to benefit, your spouse is going to benefit, your parents are going to benefit, those types of things. Okay, then that has to be, that trade is going to have a lower priority than trades for clients and employers. Now, again, we have this hierarchy that puts clients first, then employers, and then you and I at the bottom of the heap. So also, you can't use knowledge of pending trades for personal gain, so you can think of this as front running, right? So if you know there's going to be a big block order to buy some stock, and that's going to cause the price to jump up, and that's going through this afternoon, well, you can't go in and buy a few hundred shares this morning in order to benefit from the bump in price for that from this block trade, for instance. So this is basically what we call front running. So you can't front run these trades in order to have personal gain, and that's pretty straightforward. Okay, what about beneficial owner? That's direct or indirect personal interest. So you're reading a scenario, somebody is working in a research department, and she gets her husband to have an account at some other brokerage, and then says, hey, you might want to buy firm X. Well, if the person lives in your house, certainly if they are your spouse, you are a beneficial owner and you're receiving at least indirect personal interest in the securities. Client and employer transactions take priority. We already said that. And this one is actually a good head fake question on the exam. So family member accounts that are client accounts must be treated like any other account. So the standard trick here would be, well, we have some, Fred, somebody is an analyst or portfolio manager at some company, and he has 10 clients, plus he also manages his Aunt Ruth's portfolio. Well, and then it goes on to say, but he always trades for Aunt Ruth's portfolio last to avoid the appearance of evil. Well, that sounds good, right? I'm avoiding the appearance of evil here, appearance of impropriety. So I'm always trading for Aunt Ruth last. Well, if Aunt Ruth is just a client, she pays just like everybody else. We can't disadvantage Ruth, right? So a family member account is an account. Okay, they're going to be charged the same fees. They're going to be treated the same. Well, we can't systematically disadvantage them. Is the point of this last bullet point. And it's easy to make it sound like somebody's trying to be the good guy. And in fact, they may be trying to be the good guy. Okay, but still, if you're Aunt Ruth, you don't like that. In terms of more recommended procedures here, firms' compliance procedures should, limit participation in equity IPOs, and restrict purchase of securities through a private placement. Obviously, these things are fairly similar, right? So we're bringing some securities to market here. If it's an oversubscribed issue, then we've got to decide what we're going to do with those in terms of allocating them to clients. And we shouldn't have our employees are taking most of the shares that were allocated in a hot IPO, for instance, right? So that would be putting the employees' portfolios ahead of the portfolios of our clients and the employer and all that sort of thing. Recommended procedures for priority of transactions. Okay, establish blackout or restricted periods. Okay, that again, we have some sort of knowledge about security, some material, non-public information perhaps. Well, we're going to have a blackout period. You're an employee of this firm. You can't trade for this 30-day period or something because we are on a mission to serve our client, and if we were trading here, we may be taking advantage of inside information or something like that. Establish reporting procedures and prior clearance requirements. So what about reporting procedures? What do employees, that is analysts, what do they have to report to the employer? Okay, and maybe even prior clearance. So if you're going to trade, if you're an analyst following some particular industry, okay, if you're going to trade in that industry, it's not just a matter of saying what you did ex post, that would be reporting procedures, but there may be, in fact, the requirement to have prior clearance. Oh, I want to buy 400 shares of this company for my personal portfolio, and it'll run through compliance, and they'll say, well, we've had our recommendation as a buy outstanding for 94 days. This is a part of a normal savings program for this person. They're not following this firm specifically. There's no upcoming changes noted. Well, okay, it'll be all right. But you had to get permission in advance. Okay? And then disclose policies on personal investing to clients if they request it. So again, this would be things like reporting procedures and prior clearance requirements and that sort of stuff. If the clients ask for that, then the firm needs to be ready to tell them exactly what's going on. All right? All right, so that brings us to 6C, referral fees. So here we're talking about just what you would think, a referral fee. We are referring a client to some third party, and in exchange, they're going to send us back a check or tickets to the Mets game or whatever it happens to be, or the other way around. Somebody's going to send us a client, and then we're going to pay them for the referral, right? So these are referral fees, and they can either be something we receive or something we pay. Well, we need to disclose to the employer and clients and prospective clients any compensation, consideration, benefit, doesn't have to be money, that we receive from or pay to others for recommendation of the product or service. So whether we are paying the referral fee or receiving the referral fee, okay, then, and again, it could be monetary, it could be, tickets to the game, it could be, membership at a club, whatever it happens to be. Okay, we have to disclose that to the employer, clients, and prospective clients. So referral fees. So the disclosure, and the idea here is the disclosure allows the clients and or the employer to evaluate the full cost of service and any potential biases. So if you're my client, I have some discretionary authority over your portfolio. You also need to have insurance needs. And I say, well, why don't you go talk to Hank about your insurance needs? Okay, well, why did I recommend Hank? Is it because I think he's the best, insurance guy around, or is it because he, slips me $50, right? So we need to understand or allow the client to at least have a heads up about evaluating whether there's any biases there and understand the full cost that they're paying when they take me on as their money manager. Disclosure is to be made prior to entering into any formal agreements for services. So before we agree to provide services or our client goes to somebody else, we have to have a disclosure made about the nature of this arrangement, and then the nature of the consideration also. Is this money? Is it something else that we're going to receive? Well, that's our referral fees. Okay, so encourage the firm to have a clear policy regarding referral compensation. And what you're going to see is that the next line actually gives away the preference of the creators of the ethics material, and that is firms that do not prohibit should have a clear approval process. And what that sounds like to me is they really would have liked to say, let's just not have referral fees, right? So that's just, it stinks too much of under the table type, here's $100 or $5,000 or whatever it is. Anyway, so I think that the preference would be to have no referral fees, but it's such a part of our industry. It's like the tobacco industry. The only reason we have a tobacco industry in the United States is because of legacy considerations. At least that would be my interpretation. Same thing here. This has been part of a legacy of how we've done business. So we're trying to shine some light on it. We really wish it wouldn't exist. So if I were taking the exam and I saw something on referral fees, I would read that really closely, because I think what this is saying is the attitude is this is, even if we have disclosure, it still just kind of stinks a little bit, right? So members should update referral compensation disclosure to employer at least quarterly. Notice how a lot of this is at least annual updates. This is another sign to me that we really would like to not have referral fees. So you got to have clear policies. If you choose not to prohibit it, which kind of makes you sound like a second-class citizen, you got to have quarterly rather than annual updates. So they're really trying to shine some light on this if they allow it to exist at all, right? That brings us to Standard 7. This is the one we've been looking for. Of course, we got some stuff to do after we finish this, so don't get too excited. But this is the seventh one that gets us through this standards of professional conduct. And I'm sure you're out of Red Bull, or that your Red Bull is out of you by now anyway. So it takes a long time to get through this. Again, I'm just going to reiterate that digging in, taking notes in the margin of your Schweizer notes, underlining that type of thing, you can significantly improve your ability to earn some points on the exam. And I think my bias is that ethics is a low average score component on the exam, meaning most people don't do very well. So if you're able to do well, I think this is a place where you have the possibility to set yourself apart. I know this works, at least back in the 1800s it worked, because I'm not going to give in too much of a confessional here, but I did poorly on ethics when I took levels 1 and 2 because I assumed, hey, I'm a good person. I don't beat my spouse, or, don't sell my kids Adderall so I can buy heroin or anything like that. So I think I'm a good person. I ought to be able to read an ethics question and understand what's ethical. So I did poorly because I didn't take it seriously, but I was mad about it. So when I took level 3, I really dug into my Schweizer material, and I don't know that I do know that I did much, much better. Let's put it that way. So anyway, digging into the minutia here can, in fact, make a difference for you if you're willing to put in the time to do it. And it might be an area where you can actually set yourself apart a little bit to get higher up that distribution. So anyway, what is it that you've done here? Okay, well, the first 6 standards, those are things that we could reasonably attribute to any professional in our industry, right? We can say, look, this is ethical behavior. You haven't specifically committed to it because you're not a CFA candidate or a CFAI member. Okay, but all this is a good statement of ethical material or ethics standards, and I actually believe that. I think it's very well done, and I appreciate CFAI promulgating it. Okay, but this one, Standard 7, this is something you've done to yourself. Okay, the world did the first 6 to you, right? So that's just economics and what is right and what is wrong all coming together there. This one you did to yourself because you decided to sit for the CFA exam. So congratulations. These are things that you've taken on yourself. So Standard 7A, okay, conduct as participants in the CFA Institute programs, which means you're a CFA charter holder or you're a CFA candidate or anything else with CFAI. So you're not to engage in any conduct that compromises the reputation or integrity of the CFA Institute or the CFA designation, or the integrity, validity, or security of CFAI programs. So integrity, validity, security. Well, reading between the lines, I think they're talking about the integrity, validity, and security of the CFA exams here. Broader than that, obviously, but that would be a common interpretation, or where we would see flaws in this occur. So anyway, we're not to engage in any conduct that compromises the reputation or integrity of the institute or the designation or any of the programs. That's the basic 7A. So guidance here, this includes, cheating on the exam is ruled out. So you can't cheat on the exam and be in compliance with the ethics material, which is a real downside because the exam is actually, in my opinion, really hard, and I've studied finance for a long time, and I still think the exams are hard. So it also includes disregarding rules and policies or security measures related to exam administration. So this is about what you can take into the exam and, all those types of things. So you're going to be stressed when you get to the last week of the exam, but you just need to read that sheet that they send you. Here's the 500 things you can't take in. Here's the 4 things that you can take into the exam. Here's what you have to do when you get there, all that type of stuff. And you just have to comply. So I went to a country I won't name one time, and I came out of this tent jetway. It was in the third world. And when I cleared into what they called the airport terminal, there was a guy standing on a podium with a carbine staring down at me. I would have done anything he told me to do. It didn't matter. Same thing here. Whatever it says to do, just do it, right? So don't try to get away with something stupid that they then write up a report on you and they vacate your passing score or something like that. So anyway, don't disregard the rules about the exam. And then this one, giving confidential information to candidates or the public. That would be, we're going to describe that, but they have put essentially a gag order on talking about the exam here. So this is going to be something big. So what's the guidance here? Conduct includes improper use of the CFA designation to further personal or professional objectives. So this is a little bit, if you don't read this right, it's a little concerning because, you're sitting for the CFA exams because you want to advance your professional objectives, and that's probably related closely to your personal objectives. Okay, but remember, this is improper use, right? So there's a proper use of the CFA designation. That is, here I've achieved this professional designation. This is what it says about me. Okay, if you're using it improperly, you're making claims that aren't true about it or something like that, that would be improper use of the designation. So misrepresenting the CFA Institute Professional Development Program. So this is it's the voluntary continuing ed program for CFAI. So every year I get a statement and I say, it says, have you completed these things? And because of my job, I'm a college professor, I almost always have just done those naturally. So I say, yes, I've done them, and then they sometimes send me a certificate saying, oh, congratulations, you're still not dead. But if I were lying about that, that's misrepresenting to CFAI something on their professional development program. That would be a violation of way back to Standard 1 in terms of misrepresentation. It's also a violation here since it specifically applies to CFA programs. So, and the professional conduct statement. So every year when I pay my fees, I have to sign something saying I'm still a good person. Always a little confused by that because if I wasn't a good person, it probably wouldn't bother me to say that I was. But anyway, most professional designations have something like that. Okay, don't disclose. So here we've talked about, required disclosures. The difference here is these are the don't disclose things. So you can't disclose formulas tested or not tested on the exam. So you can't say, you didn't need the formula for holding period return. You did need the formula for, capital asset pricing model. So after the exam, you can't talk specifically about formulas tested or not tested. Specific question information, okay, that is, there was a question on pricing a float-for-float currency swap that involved, a decrease in the value of the yen, so detailed question information. And then topic emphasis, okay, on the exam or topics tested. So this is effectively a gag order, that's a little bit strong, on talking about the exam after the fact. I would interpret it as being a little too strong, but nonetheless, no one asked me. But on the exam, when you're taking the exam itself, okay, there's very few things you can talk about. Okay, referring to a player in a question on the exam, there's very few things you can talk about after you get out of the exam, right? Because you're not supposed to talk about formulas or what was or wasn't tested, specific questions, information, topics that were emphasized, topics that weren't tested. Those are all off limits, right? So standard 7B, reference to the CFA Institute, the designation or the program. So when referring to the CFA Institute, membership, designation, candidacy, all that sort of stuff, you can't misrepresent or exaggerate the meaning or implications of membership in CFA Institute, holding the CFA designation, or candidacy in the CFA program. So you can make factual statements, but you can't misrepresent what's going on there. So in effect, you have to, I guess you're limited to sort of factual statements about what it would imply. So the guidance, CFA Institute membership, Okay, you have to complete your professional conduct statement annually. So every year I've got to sign something saying, no, I haven't been indicted. No, I haven't done this. No, I haven't done that. Yes, I have done this. So I've got to attest annually to the fact that I am a good person, is the way I summarize that. Okay, they seem very interested in having me pay my membership dues every year. So I have to pay those dues every year. And if I don't do those two things together, or I don't do those two things, either of those two things, then my membership will go to inactive status. So I can still a member, but it'll be inactive, which has some implications. So use of the marks Chartered Financial Analyst, or CFA, okay, in a manner that does not misrepresent or exaggerate the meaning or implication of holding the CFA designation. So I can put CFA after my name on my business card. One, it should probably be in the same size font, shouldn't have flashing lights around it, and it probably shouldn't say that not only am I able to beat the market, but I'm also sexier than anybody else that doesn't have the CFA, right? So I can't talk about, can't exaggerate what it means. I could make factual statements. I could say, well, there's only 120,000 worldwide, or only X percent of the people that initially sign up complete, or I completed completed 3 exams and 3 tries, or something like that. I can make factual statements, but I can't exaggerate its meaning to say this means that I'm smarter than everybody else or better looking than everybody else, although it's probably true. Anyway, in my case, I'm kidding. Anyway, so reference to the program. Candidates can reference participation in the program, but you can't imply achievement of any partial designation. So after you finish level 1, you can say you passed level 1 of the CFA exam, right? That's a factual statement, okay? And once you sign up for level 2, you can say you're a level 2 candidate, okay? But you can't say I'm a level 2 CFA or I'm a level 1 CFA or something like that. So again, you can make factual statements. I passed all of the exams on the first attempt, if in fact you did that, okay? But you can't say this implies that I'm something more than I am. And improper use, again, of the CFA marks. So this can either be used after a charter holder's name or as an adjective, not as a noun. And so whenever I'm doing the ethics videos, which I seem to be the one that draws the short straw and has to do ethics frequently here at Schweizer, or Kaplan Schweizer, then I'm very careful to say I am a charter holder. Because what you will commonly hear is people say, I am a CFA. Okay, that is improper. That's using the CFA term as a noun. So I am a CFA charter holder, but I have to use them either after my name or I have to use them as an adjective, never as a noun. So don't use the CFA designation in pseudonyms. So, CFA, big time CFA, or something like that, or online names that hide your identity. So if you're going to be online, you're going to use CFA, then you can't hide your identity as part of that. So you can go online, you don't have to reveal your identity, but you can't use the CFA designation as part of that process. And then finally, the slide we've been looking for, at least with respect to the standards of practice, this is the last one, recommended procedures. Make sure that your employer is aware of the proper references to the CFA designation and CFA candidacy. And if you do that, then you won't be too far out of compliance with this standard 7B, right? Okay, so that's the standards of professional conduct. So let's take just a quick second and review. So we started out, we did some preliminary stuff, right? We talked about what bad outcomes, so professional or disciplinary reviews, those types of things. Then we talked about the code of ethics, and that was these 6 statements, which were, poetic in nature, and I think that most people would agree if everyone in the world lived by those principles, the world would be a better place. But they're also so broad that they're hard to write multiple choice questions on, or any test questions on, would be a better way to put that. So if you're not writing test questions on that, what are you writing test questions on? Well, I think a big portion of it is going to come out of this thing that we just finished doing. That is the standards of professional conduct. That is going through each of these 7 parts, through each of the subparts, understanding what the standard says, the guidance, you can think of that as required elements, and then what would be recommended, what would help you live up to these standards, because again, we're not looking for minimums. If we were looking for minimums, we'd say what's legal. Okay, we're looking for elevation of the quality of practice because we're talking about ethics, not what is legal. So recommended procedures, there may be times when they're not appropriate, but they're going to be something that generally are going to help you live up to a higher standard. And but the problem with that for the exam, at least in my view, is separating what is required and what is recommended, because they start to sound a lot alike. So you're going to have to spend some time thinking about the differences between those two. Once you get that down, you still have some stub material to go, but I think you can feel like you've made a lot of headway in the ethics material. If you've been listening to this point, you've been taking notes, well, you've got a lot of it behind you, so congratulations on at least an interim victory.